And it's through that type of evidence-based research that we can say, okay, you should probably, if you're going to bias, you should probably get the vaccine or you should probably not.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jim Hoven, your host of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast, and I want to welcome you back. This is going to be a really fun edition today because I'm bringing back the head of our medical sciences division, Dr. Don Cooper, and he's done several episodes with us now, and I always look forward to these because the way that his mind works, the things he's working on, the things we're working on, the law firm in the med sciences division are exciting, cutting edge stuff. So I can't wait for you to hear what he's been working on, what he's found, what we're doing, and how it may affect not only you today, but you in the future. So today, we are proud to have Don here, and he's going to share all about what we're going to be talking about today is genetics. And specifically, if you're looking at genetics to see if you might be susceptible to certain conditions, diseases, or medical processes in the future, maybe what can you do? Or if you've had a reaction, let's say, to a vaccine or something like that, could you have been predisposed to that because of your genetic makeup? So that's all in the podcast today. So you're going to want to listen to this, and you're going to be so intrigued, you're going to want to share it with someone. So let's start right away today with my guest, the one and only Dr. Don Cooper. Dr. Don, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Always great to have you back, man. I mean, we were talking before we started recording, and I'm intrigued every time you and I sit down face to face. And I mean, we get a chance to talk and connect because we both work here at Ramos Law, but just every time the things that you're working on blow my mind. Can you just give our audience just a little bit a taste and a background of what we're going to be diving into today?
Well, today I think we're going to talk about personalized medicine and lifestyle medicine. We're going to talk about some new developments in genomics technology, and one of specifically is the polygenic risk score and how we can use that in order to assess an individual's risk for developing certain pathological conditions. Here at the law firm, I've been very focused over the last year looking at vaccine injuries, and we've had several clients who have really devastating injuries in response to the vaccinations. And these include strokes and blood clotting and
Are we talking about
dementia.
Different kinds of vaccinations? Or are you talking about specifically just the COVID vaccination when you say that these reactions? What are you seeing?
Well, it spans any type of hyperimmune activation, and that typically comes from a vaccine. But we've seen it with influenza. We've seen it with mainly COVID because that's there've been, I don't know how many, 1 billion doses of COVID over the past 2 years. So we tend to see a lot more of the COVID vaccine doses, and it's a new technology, so it's capable of activating the immune system in a more powerful way. So we're starting to see that we were interested in whether or not there could be some predictive factors. Is why we wanted to answer the question why some people may have a devastating or serious adverse reaction to a vaccine and why others simply don't. And so we thought, well, maybe it's their underlying genetics that might convey some type of vulnerability. And so now we're starting to get that data back.
Was that the original question that got you on this path, Don? I know that when we first started med sciences, we had this kind of triple head thing of what we were going to do. There were going to be these 3 kind of divisions. Mm-hmm. And then as time has gone on, I mean, with your background, PhD, neuroscience, all these kinds of things, you have such a varied, already deep history and deep knowledge of these kind of things. But I'm interested on what took you to the question of the genomics behind all this, the genetic factors that led to implications. Where did that question even pop in your mind originally, or was that something that you saw somewhere else? Or?
Well, that's a good question because I think it's really, through talking with Dr. Ramos and having that background of both the law side and the medicine side. And if you think about what's it going to take to, if you have clients that were injured by a vaccine and you have to take that to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and you're going to file a petition on behalf of your client saying that they were injured by a vaccine. Well, the court's going to say, well, you're going to have to provide a biological theory of causation. So how do we do that? We've got a new vaccine. We know nothing about it. We have no evidence to support, but we do see that people are 2 days after they get a vaccine, they have a stroke. So we know that at least paired in time, there's pretty compelling data that suggests that the vaccine is causing something. But the court is still going to say, well, you're going to have to prove it. So when I started on this, it's something that I said, well, if we're going to prove this, then what's the most powerful technology we can use right now? And my background in genomics just led me to, well, we'll just sequence them. We'll do whole genome sequencing of everybody who has an adverse reaction. We'll get their entire sequence, and then we'll just look for gene variants. And we'll be able to explain why somebody had a stroke, why somebody had a blood clot, why somebody had cognitive decline by looking at the vulnerability genes and combined with their immune system, which genes are responsive to immune activation. And then we can offer that to the court. So we could submit to the court all the genetic information and say this person had a vulnerability. And that explains why this person versus anybody else had an injury.
And I think it's important to note that you are not a quote unquote anti-vaxxer. You're not coming at this from trying to rid the world of all vaccines and think that they're all horrible. You're coming at this from the science perspective of saying, wait a minute, I see a trend here and I got to investigate this. I got to see it through. And you and I have talked about this many times. And I think it's interesting where your point, I think, is really valid of, because I was like, man, the number of injuries, it's super scary to me. And it led me to my philosophy and my thought process. And you made a great counterpoint saying, well, on the other side, if you're giving 1 billion doses of anything, more people are going to be responsive in a negative way than if the sample size were smaller. Yeah. So as you see that now, looking at it now, do you think, and again, we're just playing in perspectives here and, and maybe in projections, but do you think we should have, not we, but those people that were creating the vaccine and it was all in a rush in order to try to help the population from their point of view, should they have thought about genetic testing and checking that, or is this just such a rare thread of thought of like, no, we never did that for anything else. Why would we do that for this? Because what I'm wondering then, the reason I ask is, does that make someone negligent if they say, well, if they had this and this and this group of genes, then they're going to be at risk, and holy crap, we don't want to go there. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to look at what the standard is, and I don't think you can hold. It's a complicated question because as far as the genetic side, should they have done the genetic testing? Well, just think about where genetics has gone, how far it's come, and what knowledge should they be responsible for applying this technology. And I mean, we have the first clinical study to actually look at genome sequencing and vaccine adverse effects. I mean, we have the first study, so it's not like there is a pool of information that they could have said, Pfizer could have said, or Moderna, it could have said, why don't we do genetic testing? Over the past 20 years, so with whole genome sequencing in 2003 was the first human genome sequence. It was $3 billion. Over that time period.
$3 billion?
$3 billion to do the first genome. And the cost, now in 2023, the cost has dropped 10 million fold. So you can get it for $100 to $200 right now. And so I like to think of this as an analogy. If you bought a $500,000 Lamborghini in 2003, you could buy that same brand new Lamborghini today for a nickel.
Wow.
That's how the cost has dropped over just the past 20 years. Wow. And so if you want to know, well, you sequence 8 billion base pairs, and you're looking for some 83 million single nucleotide polymorphisms that convey some type of risk towards any condition, then that's a lot of data to go through. And so how many people, you had one person in 2003, and now we have more. We have, every day we have more studies, but there simply isn't the information, especially for vaccine injury, because that's very difficult to get that population. If there's 1 in 10,000, 1 in 30,000 who has an adverse reaction, that's not a large pool for researchers to go after. And that's something that we have access to. And it's kind of a unique resource that we have here, because who do they call when they have an injury? They call a law firm who's qualified and registered with the U.S. Court of Federal Claims for the vaccine court. And And Dr. Ramos is a member of the bar there, and so we can take those cases and petition. And so we have this population, a very enriched population that we can study. And so we're finding, the things that we're finding right now is we're identifying genes that are associated with the different types of blood clotting, stroke, et cetera. So it's very exciting that we can actually see now that there is this underlying genetic risk that we believe is responsible for why some people have a vaccine injury and others don't.
That's really powerful. I want to go back to one definition, and will you just kind of explain to the audience what it means when someone has one of these genetic variants, and I think you called it a single nucleotide something.
Polymorphism.
Polymorphism.
SNP, yeah.
A SNP. Will you describe, because you talked about all these gene pairs that are out there.
Yeah.
So when someone is thinking, well, I wonder what my system looks like, describe how the process works. So you got all these things paired up and they're doing their deal, and then one of them doesn't look like the rest of them, which makes it this amorphic creature that leaves it susceptible. Can you just kind of go through that? I think that's a really good foundation of what people can see.
Sure. So I mean, if we break it down to what we've known in genetics for a long time, we've known that essentially the human genome codes for about 20,000 genes. And that means that's about 20,000 proteins. So everything that we are is basically 20,000 proteins. So how do you go from 8 billion base pairs for DNA that codes for only 20,000 genes and 20,000 proteins? That means that usually a gene is somewhere around the order of 1,000 base pairs. So there's a huge amount of this. Think about the genome as a ball of spaghetti, but only a small fraction of that, like maybe 2%, is actually coding for proteins. The rest of it is all it's called introns. It's not actually coding, but it's involved with determining how efficiently these genes are expressed or translated. So it's how much access in this big ball of spaghetti or ball of yarn, that how much access the protein machinery for transcribing it gets to in order to express these genes. So it's about efficiency, and these little SNPs are mutations that have occurred over the past, let's say, 100 to 200,000 years that we've been around on this planet. Over that time, there are little mutations that creep into the genome. And there's some of them are fairly common. We have about 5 million fairly common SNPs. And so when you go to places like 23andMe, you've heard of 23andMe and some of these ancestry things. So you can use those SNPs in order to track your lineage. Did you come out of European history or an African history or Asian? You can trace your ancestry all the way back based on these SNPs. And so it's just over time we've accumulated these things. And most of the time, these are inert and they don't have any consequences. Sometimes, though, if you combine them, and this is the major advancement that's occurred with the polygenic risk score recently, is prior to whole genome sequencing, we knew that the focus was on, well, if you have a particular SNP, if you have like a SNP that gives you a gene variant that gives you the BRCA mutation for breast cancer. This is the one where Angelina Jolie had breast cancer. She has the BRCA variant. That means she has an 85% chance of getting breast cancer that could be fatal. And so she just elected to have a double mastectomy. And there are others like the ApoE4 variant for Alzheimer's, where you have a much higher incidence of developing Alzheimer's if you have this double mutation. Those are single variants. Those are called pathogenic variants. And those are very, very rare that one variant can cause that pathology. And that's all that we had up until a few years ago, where we started looking at multiple genes, where we can start looking at millions of these SNPs together and putting them into an algorithm where we could say, well, what's your additive risk of all of these, of 1,000 different genes towards heart disease? And we'll just add up the incremental risk. So each one may add 1% risk. Well, now we see that if you look at all of your particular profile, we can say that you have a 25% chance of developing heart disease. So that's really the advancement that's occurred really over the last, let's say, 5 years.
That's incredible. And so is it commonly used now as we'll call it a pre-diagnostic tool, or is it still something that's really, really in the minority? Who gets these kind of tests? Is that something that you and I can and should just go get so that we know what to expect? Or are doctors, PCP specifically saying, no, we're going to manage differently for now?
Well, like I said, in 2003 it was $3 billion. In 2007 it was $10 million to get to sequence. So that wasn't that long ago.
No.
So, maybe 5 years ago it was 5,000. So the problem is that medical schools haven't been able to keep up with teaching doctors, what to do with this information. So if you don't have the doctors that are trained in understanding polygenic risk, their training is more in clinical genomics, where they're looking at specific pathological gene variants. So if you have a clotting disorder, they'll look at a couple different genes, or they'll look at proteins. And they'll do some in vitro assay to look at very specific markers. So right now I would say that it's not used at all in a clinical setting. It hasn't trickled its way into payers and insurers where they know what to do with it. But I think that in general, we're moving, healthcare I think is moving from what's been a treatment-centered approach, where there's been less of a focus on diagnostics, in favor of, it doesn't really matter if we know why it is. If the treatment's the same, let's just treat them. That's kind of the attitude. And so there's some cost savings there, but it doesn't really help you if you want to know more about why this particular person had this particular, pathology. Mm-hmm. And so I think now with this development of personalized medicine, where we can start looking at individual idiosyncrasies. We can look at their traits. We can see their genome. We can say, based on your genetic profile, we recommend that you take this type of blood pressure medication. You take a diuretic versus, an ACE inhibitor or some of these others. We can look at how they might respond to an antidepressant drug versus, different types of antidepressant drugs. So I think that the future, we're going to start seeing more of a personalized medicine, where medicine's going to go more to a risk-based approach, where they're going to start. I envision a day not too far in the future where people, once they have their baby, they come home with their baby. They come home with the baby, and they come home with a link to that baby's whole genome sequence and all of the risk factors that they know of at that time of what that baby has in store for it for its life.
Yes.
And then parents can adjust their they can make lifestyle sort of medicine or lifestyle choices in order to work in concert with their child's predispositions.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the future. It's just, I think it's going to take a while for medical schools and insurers to kind of catch up with that.
And right now you say that the test could be under a couple $100?
Yeah.
And so do people get that at where do you go to get a test like this?
Well, right now we use Nebula Genomics. So
how do they do it? Is it through blood? You take a blood draw?
No, you don't even need to do that. They send you a kit, and they do a cheek swab, or you do a cheek swab at home. So then you put it into the solution, and then you mail it back, and about 12 weeks later, you have a report. They do 30 times coverage, which means they go over it and they sequence it 30 times. To make sure that any errors, that you have a decreased chance of errors. And then once you have that, they have a whole bank of reports, for health reports for cardiovascular risk or Alzheimer's or left-handedness, all sorts of quirky things, but also very important things that might influence your lifestyle choices.
Yeah, I was blown away by this. The first time I heard about this was actually in the weight loss arena, where a friend of mine was using a genetic test to find out what diet is best for that person to be as lean as possible, and what exercise type. And I was reticent. I'm like, really? Could that be like some people, should do high intensity interval training versus some steady state cardio versus this? And I was like, I wonder what the percentages are of these and what that is. And then should this person have more carbs, this person have more protein? And so that was the first I had heard, and I was intrigued, but I wasn't necessarily convinced. And now what you're sharing with us is taking it to a whole nother level of, what predispositions might you have towards future events. But I want to come back to what you've found in looking at what the gene expressions are on the clients of ours that you've worked with when it comes to some of the symptoms that these people found from hyperimmune response caused by a vaccine and the correlation that you found in looking at this data from their genes.
Right. Well, so we've see the extremes. When people call a law firm and they need help, they have to satisfy some criteria that the Court of Federal Claims, this is the vaccine court, they require. And so they had to have had a serious injury and reported it, sought medical care either through ER or going to contacting their doctor within 30 days of getting the vaccine. So they have to cross that hurdle. And then it has to be serious enough to where it lasts, their symptoms from this last for at least 6 months. And so they have to go that period of time before they'll be considered. And it has to have a significant impact on their quality of life. So they have to pass all of that criteria. And so once that happens, then they call us. And then under certain circumstances, we'll look over their medical records, and we can determine whether or not they would be a good candidate for gene sequencing. And when we look at that, we see the ones that we've been focusing on are individuals who've had a stroke. So these are individuals who had the vaccine. And they could be, teenagers, healthy teenagers, had the vaccine. A couple days later, after the vaccine, it's a stroke. So we've sequenced those individuals that are in their 40s who've had a stroke, debilitating strokes, other clotting disorders, vascular disorders. And what we're seeing is that these individuals, when we do their sequencing, we're finding that they are in the 100th percentile for polygenic risks for things like clotting.
Wow. And was it the elements within the vaccine, the things, the recipe of the vaccine that caused the hyperimmune response that caused that particular symptom, or can we tell? Or was it the fact that the hyperimmune response was what caused the symptom? Does that make sense, that question?
Well, I mean, we'll just stick to the data, what we know. What we know is that somebody got a vaccine. The person who got the vaccine is in the 100th percentile risk for developing a blood clot. Because of their set of genes.
Okay, so
we know this based on let's say a Nature Genetics study looks at 500,000 Europeans, and they look at the ones that go on to have some kind of thromboembolism or clot, and then go on to have a stroke. And then they say, okay, based on that, how many of them can we tell from a pattern of their, however many genes they sequenced or they looked at, which are the highest risk genes? And they come up with, say, 500, right? And then say, okay, well, what are the chances that any given person, you would have all 500 of those? It's pretty rare, right? So when you're in the 100th percentile, for the cases of our clients where we've seen this multiple times, that's how we know that this is real, is of the pool, let's say, of Nebula, they've done 5,000 genomes, and they say, okay, you submit your DNA to it. Where are you in this? And when we look at the ones who have had strokes, they're in the 100th percentile. That means they're in the top 50 people of 5,000. That's the top 1%.
Wow. And
so it's statistically, it's astronomically, the odds are astronomical that you would have this by chance.
Yes.
So it's billions, 1 in billions that somebody would have, that we would find. Let's say we've sequenced 50 people, and we find of those 50 people, we've got 17 gene variants that are in all of them. And they're all a risk. So it's the odds of that happening through chance are astronomical. So now that we have 17 genes right now. We're in an opportunity right now to now convert that to the next phase. We want to now say, can we take these 17 variants and can we make a chip? Can we make some kind of assay to where you don't have to necessarily be sequenced, but you can take this at-home test and then determine whether or not you might be at risk for a vaccine. Because people still have to make a decision as to vaccinate themselves or their kids. We don't know what new variants are going to come along in the next year for COVID or any other, pandemic or virus that might come along. And so we have to make this decision. Am I going to get the next latest, greatest booster or not? Mm-hmm. And so if we have 17 genes that can tell you if you're part of that, if you have all 17 of those, probably want to rethink whether or not getting the vaccine is going to be the best alternative to what are your risk factors for actually getting, say COVID. Because sometimes there are gene variants where people are protected against COVID. We know those genes too. So we can look for both whether someone is less likely to have a serious effect to COVID, and we can see which ones are more likely to have an adverse reaction to the vaccine. And it's through that type of evidence-based research that we can say, okay, you should probably, if you're going to bias, you should probably get the vaccine or you should probably not.
That makes sense. Now, kind of to circle back to my question, is the thing so those people with the 17, they're the 1% or the 100th percentile, they were walking around fine before getting the vaccine. They still had all these variants, right? Like it was what it was. That's what they're given, but they were okay. So they get the stimulus that created this was the vaccine. Was it because of what was in that vaccine versus another one? Again, was it the recipe of items that created the immunologic inflammatory response that led to the symptoms, or was it just the fact that the inflammation went so high that's what triggered the symptoms, or do we know?
Oh, those are all good hypotheses. I mean, we don't know.
Okay.
Now, what we know is that if you got an injection, you had an event, and you happen to be in some risk.
And this was your genes.
So you can fill in the blanks,
yes,
with whatever hypothesis you want, but you still have to test that. So I think of it like this. I think if you look at somebody who has a high risk for developing, say, a deep vein thrombosis, which is a clot in the legs, you look at all of the different factors that might lead to somebody having a clot that might turn into a pulmonary embolism or something like that. Well, you look at women over the age of 35 who are on oral contraceptives. That's an six-fold increase in your risk of developing a deep vein thrombosis. Add to that obesity. Let's say that's a 3 times increase. Add to that immobility. So they go on a long flight across, from here to Europe for 13 hours. That increases it another 2-fold. Let's say that they're on cancer therapy. So they're taking some anti-cancer therapeutic drugs, and that increases their risk another 10-fold. So all those types of things, and you could go, let's say they're a smoker, that increases. So you look at, those are 5 things that I just listed that give you fold increases in your risk. Mm-hmm. Well, what is it about each one of those things that causes that increased risk when that person ends up having a deep vein thrombosis? All those things work together. What we think is that, this is just our hypothesis, but we think that it's similar to any number of those, like let's say cancer therapy. If you get a vaccine that's activating your immune system, you know that it's activating your immune system because most people who get the vaccine, at least let's say the COVID vaccine, most people who get that vaccine, within the first 2-3 days, they have feelings of flu-like symptoms. They have, they don't feel well. They have muscle aches. They've got headache. They get a little bit of a fever. Those are all common. And that's just a symptom of your immune system functioning. In some people, it works. We hypothesize that it's in some people that it's working a little bit too effectively, and it's called hyperimmune activation. And we think that there is this relationship between immune activated genes. These are genes that are turned on by immune system activation. We think that because of, and if we're to say, if it turns out that these mRNA-based vaccines are more effective at turning on your immune system than live virus then that would help explain why there appears to be more people who are responding with adverse reactions to the mRNA-based vaccines. And that kind of comes back to your initial question: is what should they have known? What should the CDC and FDA and Pfizer, what responsibility did they have under the conditions of the pandemic in order to do further testing before releasing this new gene therapy in the mRNA vaccine? Right. So,
yeah.
And I think that's a very good question, and it uncovered a kind of vulnerability that we have in our society, that you can almost do anything under the conditions of a pandemic, and you suspend. In many ways, we suspended all scientific process in order to pursue whatever was expedient. And so they all chose the spike protein to make their vaccines off of. For both Moderna and Pfizer used the spike protein. They had other choices they could have used, but that was what was there. And so a good scientific process would have been, looking at, what's the history that we have with live viruses, and what's our total history of vaccination, and can we plug it into that system, versus do we need to jump to a new platform? And if we do jump to a new platform, what are the risks going to be? And how many people do we actually have to get clinical data from in order to determine if it's safe? And is 30,000 enough? You're giving out 350 million doses. Are you going to tolerate 1 in 30,000? And are they all healthy volunteers that you're giving it to? What about people who are on cancer therapy and who have diabetes and who are obese? And is there an additive risk when you're giving them this new gene platform? So I think there are a lot of questions that, in retrospect, we probably should reevaluate our approach.
That's a great point. I mean, that just sounds logic. And in a time of world panic, I mean, decisions get made and things get done, but hopefully we learned from that and can move on. Because what you've said so far, I mean, I love everything that you've said, but one of the things that really stuck to me is this term, this personalized and precision medicine that we're moving into. And so I want you to discuss a little bit about that, Dr. Don, about where we can start using now. And you alluded to it briefly with the mom bringing the baby home, with this kind of thing. But I just see the potential in knowing what my gene sequence looks like, knowing where my potential vulnerabilities are, and then how we can use that through lifestyle choices, as you mentioned, and through any number of things. But give me the Star Trek version of what's possible now as you see it right now. Like, what could we go to the teleprompter room or the portation room like they could in Star Trek? What do you see from this therapy in the future for us?
Boy, what comes to mind first is my son Channing. He's 16. He's in track and field, and he just started sprinting. It turns out that he's good at the 100 meters, and so he wanted to get sequenced. So he sequenced him, and he wants to know if he has the same gene variant that Usain Bolt has. So
perfect.
It turns out that there is a gene variant. There's a couple different genes that are involved with sprinting and power for muscle. It's an actin. It's an ACNT3 gene, and about 20% of Caucasians have a stop codon mutation in it to where it doesn't express this. And so if they don't express that, then they don't have this sprint power. So he wanted to know that. And that's just something that I think is kind of a fun thing it's, if you look on the horizon of, what's the future, if your kids are interested in knowing whether or not they're going to be good athletes or something like that, it's something you could give them a profile and they can say, the likelihood is you'd probably be a good thrower, you'd probably be a good sprinter, or maybe you'd be a better endurance athlete. And so this could actually influence whether or not he decides to run the 400, which I wouldn't wish that upon anyone, versus the 100 meter, right, or the mile. And so I think that these are the kind of interesting things that our kids are going to have access to that I wish we had when growing up. We would decide what we're going to be better at versus not. Yeah. And I think that extends to a lot of different things. That's just something that's just kind of a lifestyle thing, but also for precision medicine, you can just imagine the types of therapies, of prevention, of are you going to be more susceptible to or more responsive to a Mediterranean diet or this type of diet. It's really, I think that what we're going to see in the future is we're going to see consumers actually going to company paying for this as an add-on to insurance, going to companies and saying, you know what, I want to sit down with a doctor and talk about my lifestyle, my environmental factors, what's going on in my life, socioeconomic sort of factors, and just your genetics, and then going through that with a review and saying, okay, based on this, here's a diet, here's an exercise regimen, here's a mental health thing, here's what we can do with in terms of your socialization, your friends, things like that, all coming together in order to optimize health. And I kind of see that's hopefully what the future is.
Man, I love that so much. And I think you talked about it already in a different way. When you talked about optimizing the future, I could see where by knowing some of this information, it would kind of be a double-edged sword, right? Like, where if, let's say your son wanted to be the next Usain Bolt, and he's doing good for his age, and then if he sees that and it doesn't confirm that he has the great sprinter's gene, then what could it discourage him from chasing his dreams? So there's maybe the other side of that. But I think for the most part, imagine if it said that you have a really high predisposition to not living a long time if you don't do these things, to cancer or to some of these things you've mentioned.
Yeah.
It could be a great wake-up call to say, I need to do something now.
Yeah.
And you can't, once you have these, no matter what you do, you're not going to alter them. Like if you went from, we'll call it not clean living to total clean living over a period of years, would you show any change in that, or is that all an epigenetics thing?
Well, if you look at the statistics for lifestyle sort of medicine, you've got, 40% of all cancer deaths could be prevented through lifestyle modifications. You've got about maybe 80% could be of cardiovascular could be prevented through lifestyle, and maybe 90% for diabetes. So we already know that if you can identify early on somebody who has cardiovascular, diabetes, these types of risks, we know that lifestyle will get you a long way by doing those things. So there's definitely, what I say to Channing is that, if he has that, then it's kind of like it goes both ways. If he doesn't have it, well, you got to work harder.
Yep.
But if you do have it, you got to work harder because you want to maximize that. Why would you sit on something so valuable? You've been blessed with something that's it sets you apart from everybody else, and you're just going to sit on the couch and not do anything. So I think that it can go both ways, but I think it's important to understand that just because you have these variants, this polygenic risk score, that's going to explain some fraction of your risk. But it can. You mentioned epigenetics, and that's something that's something that you get from mainly environment, your diet, and things that turn on and turn off genes. These are things that you have the capability of changing.
Yeah, influence,
so there is no
big influence.
You have a huge influence, and you can change these things. You can do therapies. You can do all sorts of things that can directly offset any sort of risk that you have. It's just important to know that what your risks are, I think.
Yeah. Are there ethical considerations that we need to consider as we look into into the future? And if so, what would you see some of the potential ethical considerations being?
Well, I think the ethical considerations would be this information getting into the hands of insurance companies that would use this information in a way to deny you life insurance, for example.
Ooh, yeah.
So if they knew that you had a polygenic risk score of in the 100th percentile for heart disease, what are the chances you're going to get the same premium that somebody else who has, in the 1 percentile? And so I think that because of there was a genetics act, there's a law that was passed a couple decades ago that covered health insurance, but I don't think it covers life insurance. And so I still think there are some gaps in how we deal with this information. And it's usually policies and things like that, they don't keep up with the technology. So it is possible that you could know a lot of information about yourself that insurance companies would want to know, and if they found out about it, they could use that to your detriment. And I think that it's important that anytime you share that information, I just would not share that information. There's a HIPAA issue, and when people know anything about you from your genetics, then they can use that in a way that I think we haven't really seen all the different ways, but that's just one example.
Yeah.
So it's important to know that you're dealing with, if you're going to get your gene sequenced, that they have a policy in place. If you're going to participate in a research study, we give informed consent to everyone, showing that we're not going to share their data with anyone. We won't share it with the court. We'll redact their information to make sure that their privacy is protected. And so I think it's a really big problem if that data got out and there were certain actors that could use that information in order to take advantage of you. And I think you could take advantage of vulnerable populations by offering them this information. It's kind of like what's going on with social media. It's just like people share their information, and then that becomes a commodity that companies like Google and Facebook use, and in order to use your information in order to manipulate.
To market you,
exactly. And so if they can get that information from you and sequence you without your knowledge, that would be a bad scenario.
And when someone runs this report, do they need a qualified person to read it, or does the report come out that basically just summarizes it from the company that did the test, that says, here's where your variants are, and here's what it means, and you're more likely for this or less likely for that? Or does someone have to interpret that data?
Yeah. So it's kind of like people who've done Ancestry and 23andMe. A lot of that information is just kind of stock information. It says, well, you've got variants that are consistent with an increased risk, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's diagnostic and that you're going to die from a heart attack, things like that. What we do is we provide some level of interpretation. So when we have a client and I have to go through our clients, I call them up and then we go over it with them together, and we go over each of their risks and how that might influence how it might have influenced their symptoms and their adverse reaction. Now, if we find out that there are some other things that are not part of what we see on their adverse reaction, then we have an ethical obligation. I have an ethical obligation to share that information with the person. So if I see some pathogenic variants, then we're going to have to go into a counseling scenario where they may have to work this information in together with their care provider into their care plan. So that's just something but again, doctors right now are not used to dealing with and are understanding polygenic risk score. So it's we first have to kind of educate the doctors in order to understand, well, how could we use this information to work it into somebody's care plan?
Yeah.
So, that's something that we do here. If we do sequencing for someone, not only are we able to use that information to bolster their legal case, but we're also able to then provide them information to help them get better, to help them work that into their care plan.
That's so cool. It's such a great service. Speaking of that, are we still doing the clinical trial where people can go into it and become part of the data collection process?
Yeah.
How do
so
they get
all of
to
this
that?
data comes from the clinical trial.
Yeah. How would someone, if they're interested, what would make them want to go into the clinical trial? In other words, who qualifies and how would they find that?
Well, we've aligned the clinical trial criteria, inclusion criteria, to align with what the U.S. Court of Federal Claims allows for filing a vaccine injury. So they'd have to have reported it right after the vaccine within 30 days. They'd have to have ongoing serious symptoms that last 6 months. And they couldn't have their prior history in the past 3 years would have to be showing that they didn't have this ahead of time. So if they qualify for that, then that means that they're a good candidate for the vaccine injury court, which means all of their legal fees will be paid for. If they want to file a claim, we will handle that on our own. We will file it for them, and if they get a settlement, then they get to keep it all. We don't take any contingency on that, and all of the fees from the attorney's fees are paid for by the court directly. So then we invest in, when we see individuals who might be good candidates for the study, is we fund the genetics side of that, because we want to provide the most. And as far as I know, we're the only firm that does this, is we want to provide the best information to the court so that they can make a decision. Was this person injured by a vaccine? And so we have to be able to connect the dots for the court. That's an expense we're willing to take on. So hopefully it'll translate into improving the person, not only give them a better case, but also improve their therapy and their outcome.
Yeah. And if someone were interested, they just have those 3 criteria that you mentioned about, it happened within 30 days and it's serious or significant and it's been going on 6 months or longer. How would they go about finding the study to take a next step? Would they contact you, or is there a link that they go to?
Well, they could do that. They could go to our Medical Science Division webpage at Ramos Law. They can go, we're registered under all clinical trials are registered in clinicaltrials.gov. So if they look under National Vaccine Adverse Reaction Database, something like that, they'll find the study there, and then they can contact me through that, or just going to the Ramos Law.
Yeah, so if they go to ramoslaw.com, you go to Medical Sciences, Dr. Don Cooper. Also, if anyone is interested, our phone number is 303-733-6353. You can reach Dr. Cooper from that way as well, from our side of things. So, Dr. Cooper, this has been an incredible conversation. Is there any last words of wisdom that you might have for people if they're wondering about any of this, whether it's, should I get the next vaccine? I don't know now. Should I go get this sequencing done? Should I, what should I do? If this raised more questions, is there a next step that they can take to learn more at all?
Well, I think it's hard. These are really difficult questions, and mainly because of the amount of disinformation there is. It's hard to know when you look at the internet what's real and what's not. And people have all sorts of stories about how they've taken the vaccine and it's devastated their lives, and other people are saying, no, that doesn't exist. It's hard to know what's real and what's not real. And so my thinking is that the more objective data and information you can get, if you know you have certain risk factors, if you know that you have to balance the risk factors of let's say COVID. What are the chances you're going to end up in the hospital? If you're an overweight male over the age of 60, your chances of having a serious negative outcome for COVID is probably pretty high. Balance that with the vaccine. It's hard to know right now. We simply don't have enough information in order to tell the person, well, you're more likely, it'd probably be better to nudge this way or that way. And I know it's really hard for families talking about their kids. We know that for kids, though, the chances of you having a serious reaction, of a child having a serious reaction, let's say a child under 16, having a serious reaction to COVID is pretty small. It's pretty remote. So, I'm not going to say whether or not you should or you shouldn't give your kids the vaccine, but that's something you really should, read the medical journals, things like that. You have to kind of make a decision about that. And
what
weigh
about,
the difference.
so now I have another question.
Yeah.
I promised that was going to be the last one, but here we go. If we're bombarded on TV or radio with different kinds of vaccines, to where now there's something along the lines of 73 vaccines, is there any cumulative effect of having this plus this plus this plus this plus this on the immune system that would trigger this thing that we've been talking about, right? The genetic variants, or would each one have its own individual assay that could create an immunologic or inflammatory response?
So this is all a new frontier. I mean, just the very concept that a person's background genetics can influence their response to a vaccine is novel and not really researched.
Got it.
Knowing a combinatorial, the next question of combinatorial effects of well, what types of individuals, what types of risk factors, what types of clusters of genes would lead to a negative outcome for this vaccine or this vaccine. I think that I'm less likely to say that it's the constituents of the vaccine itself, where in the past they've talked about things like thimerosal and other components. I'm less likely to be interested in that as a mechanism, that in more interested in how effective is this vaccine at activating a person's immune system.
Got it.
And the issue is the immune system is incredibly complicated, and we know this from autoimmune disorders. So people can just out of the blue develop an autoimmune condition, get neuropathies and arthritis, things like that. They can have genetic risks for that, but the immune system can cause, you can get activation to your normal constituent proteins. And if your immune system is capable of turning on you, and we don't understand what's causing that, and you're giving somebody something that turns that system on, you kind of have to ask yourself, does this person have a risk for an autoimmune vulnerability? And if we crank up their immune system, are we going to give them an autoimmune disorder? Are we going to increase the risk? Are we going to push them over into rheumatoid arthritis and make it worse? These are the kind of questions these are scientific questions that we should be dedicating money to the NIH. They should be asking these questions. There should be money apportioned. We're self-funding this study. We're not getting this from the NIH. There's no entity that's funding our study here. So I think more research and more money needs to be apportioned to understanding the very questions that you're asking. Is there an effect of having multiple vaccines? Is it just immune system activation in general? So these are all good questions.
Man, what a fascinating conversation. I know the people watching, listening, they are going to want to share this with someone, because it affects every single one of us. Every one of us is made up of these genes, and so many people have to answer these questions about vaccines and other things. If you have listened to this and you found it compelling, please think about it, do what's best for yourself and your family, and also share this information with people. You might want to look at getting a genetic test. There's so many things. At the end of the day, take care of yourself, because if you'll take care of yourself, then like Dr. Don, you can make a difference too. So Dr. Don, thank you for coming today again. Mm-hmm. I think this is our third or fourth time together, and we got lots more of these planned through the Med Science Division. And for those of you watching and listening, thank you for spending time with us. Please enjoy, and please take care. And remember, you too can make a difference.